The water bucket by the door had frozen solid overnight, and the fire had never gone out. That was the part nobody could explain later. The coals were still glowing orange when Eliza Marsh knelt down to check them just after dawn, close enough to feel heat on her knuckles. And yet 6 feet away, the bucket sat with a skin of ice thick enough to hold a coin. Somewhere behind her, in the dark corner of the cabin, a small cough broke the silence. Then another. Then a pause that lasted a little too long before the next one came. She did not move toward the sound right away. She had learned, over the past 2 weeks, that moving too fast only made the coughing worse. Her husband, Caleb, was already awake, sitting on the edge of a stool with his elbows on his knees, staring at a woodpile that had looked large in October, and now, in the gray light of a January morning, looked like it might not survive the month. He was not looking at the fire. He was looking past it, toward the far wall of the cabin, the one lined with frost on the inside of the boards. That was the detail that would matter later, though nobody in that room understood it yet. The fire was doing its job. The room was not. Caleb stood up, walked to the corner where his son slept under 2 quilts and a folded coat, and pressed the back of his hand against the boy's forehead, the way his own father used to check a fever, without a word, without waking anyone. Then he walked outside into air cold enough to hurt his teeth, and stood looking at the cabin from a distance, the way a man looks at something that has already failed him once and is about to fail him again. By the time he came back inside, he had an idea that made no sense to anyone who heard it that winter. Not to his wife, not to the neighbor who would later call it the strangest thing he had seen built in that county. He was not going to make the cabin warmer, he was going to make it smaller. If you're watching this from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where. Stories like this survive because people still remember them, and if frontier ingenuity like this means something to you, sticking around helps keep it that way. The frost on the water was not the strange part. Frost on standing water was ordinary enough, in a winter like that one. What troubled Caleb Marsh was the wall behind it, the one his son's bed backed against, the one that stayed cold to the touch no matter how long the fire burned. He had built that cabin himself 3 years earlier with green lumber and borrowed tools, in the kind of hurry that comes from needing shelter before the first snow rather than needing it to last. The boards were tight enough to keep out rain. They were not tight enough to keep in warmth, and by the second winter, everyone in that house understood the difference. Eliza had stopped mentioning the cold months ago. Complaining about it changed nothing, and there was a boy in the corner who needed her calm more than he needed her worry. But she noticed things. She noticed that the fire, built up high enough to roast a hog, left the far half of the room barely above freezing. She noticed that Caleb had started sleeping in his coat. And she noticed, most of all, that their son's cough had begun to follow a pattern. Worse at night. Worse near that back wall. Better, if only slightly, when he was pulled close to the hearth during the day. Nobody in the house had said the word aloud yet, but everyone had thought it. A boy who kept coughing through a long winter in a cabin that could not hold its own heat was a boy in danger. Caleb counted the woodpile again that morning, the way a man checks a wound to see if it has grown worse. He had done this every few days since the first snowfall, and each time the number troubled him a little more. At the current rate of burning, the wood they had stacked would run out somewhere around the middle of February. Winter in that part of the country rarely let go before late March. 6 weeks was not a small gap. 6 weeks was the difference between a hard season and no season left to speak of. He had already tried the obvious remedies. He had packed rags and dried moss into the widest cracks between the boards. He had hung an old quilt across the coldest wall, more for the family's peace of mind than for any real warmth it offered. He had considered, and quickly rejected the idea of burning one of the 2 chairs his father had made. None of it changed the arithmetic. The cabin was too large for the fire they could afford to feed it, and no amount of patching was going to shrink the size of a room built from whole logs. That morning, standing outside in air sharp enough to sting his lungs, Caleb looked back at his own cabin the way a stranger might look at it. Not as a home he had built with his hands, but as a shape, a box, a space that had to be filled with heat every single night, whether there was enough fuel to fill it or not. Somewhere in that thought, an idea began to take shape that he did not yet trust enough to say out loud. Eliza was the one who finally asked the question neither of them wanted to speak plainly. "How much longer can we keep this pace?" she said, not quite as a question, while she folded a quilt that had already been folded twice that morning. Caleb did not answer right away. He was looking at the woodpile through the window, counting it again without meaning to, the way a man returns to a sum he already knows will not come out right. "Not as long as we need to," he finally said. The words sat in the room for a moment. Their son stirred under his blankets, coughed twice, and settled again. Eliza's hands stopped moving on the quilt. They had come to that land 2 winters ago, with almost nothing, arriving late in the season on the promise of a plot that turned out to be thinner soil than they had been told, and farther from town than they had been told as well. The first winter had been hard, but manageable. This one was different. The cold had come early and settled in with a kind of patience that felt, some mornings, almost deliberate. "We could burn the chairs," Eliza said, though her voice made clear she did not want to. "We could," Caleb agreed. "And then we'd have warm feet for 3 nights, and nothing to sit on for the rest of our lives." It was not really a joke, and neither of them laughed. The deeper problem, the one Caleb had begun circling in his mind since that morning by the frozen bucket, was not the wood itself. It was where the wood's heat was going. A fire built up in the hearth threw warmth into a room roughly 18 feet across and 12 feet deep, with a ceiling high enough for a grown man to stand without stooping. Most of that heat rose, spread thin, and slipped out through gaps in the roof boards and the walls before it ever reached the corner where their son slept. He was, in effect, trying to warm a barn to keep one small boy from shivering. Caleb had spent 6 years before his marriage working timber along the coast, framing small enclosed berths below decks on fishing boats, spaces built deliberately tight so that a man's own body heat, combined with a modest lamp, could keep him from freezing on a winter crossing. He had not thought about that work in years. It had never seemed to have anything to do with a farm in the middle of the country, 1,000 miles from open water. But standing at the window that afternoon, watching frost creep up the inside of the glass, the memory returned to him with a clarity that surprised him. Those berths had never been warmed by a large fire. They had been warmed by being small enough that a little heat had nowhere else to go. He did not say anything to Eliza yet. The idea felt too strange, too far from anything a neighbor would recognize as sensible. But that night, after the fire had burned low and the house had gone quiet, he lay awake doing arithmetic of a different kind, no longer counting logs, but counting feet, inches, and the rough dimensions of a bed. He told Eliza the next morning, over a breakfast neither of them finished. "I want to build a room inside the room," he said, "around the bed, just big enough to lie down in, sit up in, maybe stand bent over, walls, a low roof, a door small enough to close tight." Eliza set down her cup slowly. "A box." "A box," Caleb agreed, because there was no use pretending it was something grander. "Wood on 4 sides and the top, built right up against the corner where the 2 good walls already meet. So we're only building 3 new sides instead of 4. And we sleep in it." "We sleep in it. With a small lamp, maybe, on the coldest nights. Our own bodies do some of the work. The space is small enough that it doesn't take much to hold what heat there is." Eliza looked toward their son, still asleep, still pale in a way that had become familiar and unwelcome. She was not a woman who agreed to things quickly, and she did not agree to this one quickly either, but she also did not say no. "Where does the wood come from?" she asked instead, which Caleb understood to mean she was already halfway to yes. That was the harder question. They had no lumber set aside for a project like this, and the trees on their own land were mostly green, freshly cut, unseasoned by any proper drying time. Green wood warped. It split as it dried unevenly near a heat source. Everyone who knew anything about building knew this, which was exactly why the idea struck Eliza, and later their neighbor, as reckless rather than clever. Caleb had an answer, though not a fully satisfying one. An old shed at the back of the property, unused since before they'd bought the land, had boards that were older, already dried, already settled into whatever shape they were going to hold. Pulling it apart would cost them a shed they rarely used anyway, in exchange for material that would not fight them the way fresh-cut lumber would. It was not enough boards, not quite. He would need to fill the gap with newer wood after all, and accept the risk that came with it. He spent that afternoon walking the inside of the cabin with a notched stick, measuring the corner near the hearth, marking rough distances on the dirt floor with the heel of his boot. 6 feet by 7, he decided, tall enough near the door to duck through without crawling, low enough at the back that the space above the bed sat close, deliberately close, to whoever was lying beneath it. Eliza watched him work without saying much, though later that evening, as she helped hold the stick steady for a second measurement, she asked the question that would prove, in time, to matter more than either of them expected that night. What happens to the air in there, once the doors shut? Caleb did not have an answer yet. He would not have one for another 5 nights, and by the time he did, it would come at a cost neither of them wanted to pay. Silas Pruitt had farmed the next parcel over for 11 years, long enough to have opinions about most things, and to share them whether or not anyone had asked. He arrived on the 3rd day of construction, drawn by the sound of a hammer at hours when most sensible men were inside. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before he said anything, looking at the half-built frame rising around the bed like the skeleton of some small, awkward animal. "You're building a coffin you can stand up in," he said finally. Caleb kept working. "It's a room. It's a box with no air in it is what it is." Silas stepped closer, running a hand along one of the upright boards. "You seal a space this tight, with 2 grown people and a sick boy breathing in it all night, and you know what happens by morning? The air goes bad. I've seen it in root cellars left shut too long. Man goes in to fetch potatoes, doesn't come back out." It was not an unreasonable fear. Caleb knew that much, even as he kept fitting boards into place. Sealed spaces did turn foul. Silas had likely seen exactly what he described, or heard of it happening to someone he trusted, and he was not a stupid man for worrying about it now. "And that wood," Silas went on, nodding toward the newer boards mixed in among the shed lumber. "Half of that's still green enough to bend in your hand. It'll shrink as it dries, pull away from the joints. You'll have gaps in a month you didn't have on the day you built it." "I know," Caleb said. "Then why build it?" Caleb straightened up, wiping sawdust from his palms onto his trousers, and looked at the man for a moment before answering. "Because the wood pile runs out in 6 weeks and the winter doesn't." Silas had no argument for that. He stood a while longer, watching the frame take shape. And then he left the way he'd come, without offering to help, and without changing his opinion. He did not return for the better part of 2 weeks, though word of the strange little room inside the marsh cabin had, by then, already begun to travel further than either Caleb or Eliza expected. Caleb worked through what remained of the daylight, fitting the last of the shed boards into the low ceiling, leaving the newer green lumber for the front wall where the door would hang. Every joint was cut as tight as his borrowed tools allowed. Every seam was packed with what moss and rag he had left over. By the fourth night, the little room stood finished. A door on leather hinges, a ceiling low enough to touch standing on the bed, walls close enough on either side to reach from the middle without stretching. It looked, Eliza admitted quietly, exactly like what Silas had called it. But that night, for the first time in weeks, she and Caleb pulled their son inside, shut the door behind them, and waited to see whether the small, sealed dark around them would save him or begin, slowly, to do him harm instead. The warmth came fast, faster than any of them expected. Within the hour, the small room held a heat that the whole cabin had never managed to hold in a full night of burning. Their son stopped shivering. For the first time in weeks, his breathing settled into something close to normal, and Eliza allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that the strange little box her husband had built might actually work. By the second hour, something had shifted, though none of them could name it yet. Caleb woke first, not from cold, but from a dull ache behind his eyes, the kind that comes from a room with no proper air. His mouth felt dry in a way that had nothing to do with thirst. Beside him, Eliza was already stirring, her breathing shallow, her hand pressed instinctively toward their son before her eyes had fully opened. The boy was worse, not from cold. That much was clear immediately. His forehead was warm, almost too warm, and his breathing had gone from settled to labored in the space of a few hours. He was not shivering. He was struggling. Eliza had the door open before Caleb fully understood what was happening, dragging in a breath of the cabin's colder air, like a woman surfacing from underwater. The relief on her face was immediate and told him everything he needed to know before she said a word. "Something's wrong in there," she said. "It's not cold that's hurting him." They spent the rest of that night in the main room, their son wrapped close to the hearth, his breathing slowly easing back to something more familiar. Nobody spoke much. There was little to say that the silence didn't already cover. By morning, Caleb stood at the door of the little room he had built with such care, and for the first time since he'd started, he considered that Silas might have been right for reasons Caleb hadn't wanted to hear. It was Eliza who found the answer, and she found it almost by accident, 3 days after the failed first night, while looking for nothing more than a way to check on the room without disturbing the boards. She had brought a small candle inside to look for a gap, where cold air might be slipping through near the floor, the kind of draft that would explain, she thought, why the space had felt so heavy and wrong. What she found instead surprised her. The candle did not gutter from any draft. Instead, its flame grew smaller and weaker the longer it burned, shrinking to a faint blue point after only a few minutes, in a room that had shown no sign of any wind at all. She called Caleb in to see it for himself. He watched the flame struggle and dim, and something in his memory, some fragment from his years working below decks, surfaced with sudden, uncomfortable clarity. He had seen a flame do that before. In a sealed berth on a boat left shut too long, one of the older sailors had pulled him aside and explained it plainly. A closed space, breathed in by 2 or 3 people through a long night, slowly used up whatever good air it started with. A flame struggling to survive was an early warning. A person struggling to breathe hours later was a late one. The room was not too warm. It was not haunted, and it was not built with wood that carried some hidden defect, as Silas had implied. It was simply sealed too well, holding in every breath they exhaled with nowhere for the staleness to go, until their son's smaller lungs, already weakened by weeks of illness, had begun to struggle before any of the adults noticed anything wrong themselves. The wood had held the heat exactly as Caleb intended. It had also held everything else exactly as he had failed to intend, and the difference between those two outcomes had nearly cost them the very child the room was built to protect. Standing there with the dying candle between them, Eliza said what they were both already thinking. It doesn't need to be shut this tight. It needs a way to let bad air out, so long as it doesn't let all the warmth out with it. The fix, when it came, was almost embarrassingly modest. Caleb cut a single opening near the top of the front wall, roughly 4 inches across, fitted with a small wooden slide that could be pushed open or pulled shut by hand from inside the room. The placement mattered as much as the size. Warm, used air rose naturally toward the ceiling, carrying with it the staleness that had nearly harmed their son. A gap positioned high, rather than low, let that spent air escape before it settled thick around anyone sleeping beneath it, while the lower half of the room, where the family actually lay, stayed close to sealed and close to warm. It was not an invention, exactly. It was closer to a memory dressed up as an idea, some half-buried recollection of how those old shipboard berths had managed the same problem. A narrow vent near the top of a bulkhead, no wider than a man's hand, doing work far larger than its size suggested. Eliza was skeptical the first time he explained it. A hole in the wall doesn't sound like it fixes a hole in the wall. It's a different kind of hole, Caleb said, and even he could hear how little sense that made out loud. Small enough that the warmth barely notices it's there? Big enough that the bad air does. They tested it that same evening on a night that was cold but unremarkable, nothing close to the season's worst. Their son slept inside the little room for the first time since the failed attempt, with the vent left cracked open a finger's width. Caleb woke twice in the night, not from discomfort, but from a habit of checking, pressing his palm near the boy's face to feel his breathing. Both times, it was steady. By morning, the boy's cough had eased in a way it hadn't in nearly 2 weeks. The room held a good measure of the previous evening's warmth, not blazing, but far better than any morning in the larger cabin had offered. Eliza noted, quietly, that they had burned barely 1/3 of their usual wood to achieve it, most of that heat coming from the small lamp and their own bodies, rather than any fire at all. It was a small victory, and both of them knew it. One mild night proved very little. The season's harder tests, the ones that mattered, had not yet arrived. The first real test came 2 weeks later, though nothing about that particular evening announced itself as different from a dozen others that month. The sky had been gray and low for 3 days, heavy with a stillness that farmers in that part of the country had learned, over generations, not to trust. Silas Pruitt, riding past the marsh place on his way back from town, stopped just long enough to say what everyone in the valley already suspected. "Something's coming down from the north," he said, not looking at Caleb directly, still keeping some distance from the strange little structure he'd mocked weeks earlier. "Old man Tillett's barometer's been dropping since Tuesday. My knee's been worse than usual, and that's never wrong." Caleb thanked him for the warning, and Silas rode on without offering more than that, though his eyes lingered a moment longer on the small vent cut into the front wall of the room, visible now through the cabin's open door. By the following afternoon, the wind had shifted, coming steady now from the northwest instead of drifting the way it usually did in that valley. The temperature, which had hovered near tolerable for most of the week, began falling with a speed that made Eliza pull their son's coat and boots close to the hearth well before dark. Caleb spent the last hour of daylight checking every board of the little room by hand, pressing his palm along each seam, tightening the leather hinges on the door, packing fresh moss into 2 joints that had shifted slightly as the green lumber continued its slow work of drying and settling. He left the small vent open its usual finger's width. Then, after a moment's hesitation, closed it to half that, uncertain how much air the room could afford to lose once the real cold arrived. It was, he realized as he did it, a guess. The mild nights of the past 2 weeks had taught him how the room behaved in ordinary weather. Nobody had taught him yet how it would behave in weather that wasn't ordinary at all. That night, the first snow began falling before supper was finished, thin at first, then thickening steadily, as the wind picked up outside. By the time the family settled into the small room and pulled the door shut behind them, the wind outside had a sound to it that none of them fully recognized, low and steady, the sound of something settling in rather than passing through. Caleb lay awake longer than he meant to, listening to that sound, and to his son's breathing beside him, steady for now, and wondered how long the weather outside intended to last before it decided to test everything he had built. The storm did not pass in a single night. It settled over the valley and stayed, the kind of weather older farmers in that county would later describe, without much exaggeration, as one of the harder stretches of that particular decade. By the second morning, the snow outside the cabin had risen past the bottom of the window, and the wind showed no sign of losing interest. Caleb could not reach the woodshed without shoveling a path first, and even then, the walk there and back left his hands numb through 2 layers of wool. Inside the small room, life had narrowed to something quieter and more careful than either Caleb or Eliza had expected. They left the space only for brief stretches, to eat, to tend the larger hearth, to check what remained of the woodpile. Most hours were spent inside the low wooden walls, their son propped between them, the small vent cracked open exactly as far as Caleb had judged it should be. No more, no less. It worked for those 2 days, in a way that felt almost unremarkable. The room held its warmth through the worst of the wind. Their son's breathing stayed even. The lamp burned low but steady, needing only a small measure of oil to keep the space comfortable enough to sleep in. What worried Caleb more than the cold was the wood. He had budgeted the pile carefully since the room's completion, burning far less than the cabin alone would have demanded in the same weather. But a storm that stretched past 3 days ate into even a careful budget, and by the 3rd evening he counted the remaining logs twice, hoping the second count might come out differently from the first. It did not. If the weather broke within the next 2 days, they would manage. If it did not, the math that had troubled him back in January would return, sharper now, with less room to solve it. Eliza did not ask him how the count had gone. She had learned to read the answer on his face before he spoke it. And that evening, watching him stack the last of the split logs near the hearth, she simply reached over and pulled their son a little closer, as though proximity alone might stretch what remained a little further. It happened on the 4th night, well past midnight, in the deep quiet that settles over a storm once the wind has been blowing long enough to become its own kind of silence. Eliza woke before Caleb did, not from cold exactly, but from a change in the air against her cheek, faint enough that she lay still for a moment, questioning whether she had imagined it. She had not. A thin thread of cold air was moving across the room, low and steady, coming from somewhere near the front corner where the newer, greener boards had been fitted weeks earlier. She woke Caleb by pressing his shoulder rather than speaking, a habit they'd fallen into since their son had become such a light and troubled sleeper. He understood immediately from her face that something had changed. The wind outside had shifted direction sometime in the last hour, no longer coming steady from the northwest, but gusting now from due north, catching the cabin's front corner at an angle it had not faced before. That shift had found the one seam in the room that had never been fully tested, a joint where she'd lumber met newer wood, a joint that had held fine against a wind coming from one direction and was failing quietly against a wind coming from another. Caleb ran his hand along the seam in the dark and felt it immediately, a thin but steady draft where there should have been none, growing slightly stronger as another gust hit the cabin's north wall outside. Their son, curled between them, was still asleep, still breathing evenly for now. But the room's warmth, so carefully held for 4 days, was beginning to bleed out through a gap no wider than a finger, and neither of them knew yet whether it was already too cold outside that seam to matter, or whether they had caught it in time. There was no good option, only a choice between 3 imperfect ones, and Caleb had only moments to make it before the cold reaching through that seam grew from an inconvenience into something worse. He could try to pack the gap from the inside, using what moss and rag remained, working blind in the dark without waking their son any further than the cold already threatened to. He could open the door and check the seam from outside, in wind and snow that had not eased since the storm began, risking the loss of what warmth the room had built up over hours. Or he could wait, hoping the wind's angle would shift back before the draft widened further, a gamble that offered no guarantee and very little comfort. Eliza made the decision before he did, in the quiet, practical way she'd made most of the hard decisions since October. "Pack it now," she said, "from inside. I'll hold the lamp." Caleb worked in a space barely wide enough to kneel, pressing torn strips of wool and the last of the dried moss into the seam with fingers gone stiff from cold, working by a light too dim to see clearly by, guided more by feel than by sight. Twice he thought he had sealed it, and twice a fresh gust proved him wrong, the draft returning thin but insistent through some gap his fingers had missed. Their son stirred during the third attempt, coughing once, twice, his breathing catching in a way that made Eliza go still beside him. Caleb did not stop working. He packed the last of the moss into the seam, pressed a folded piece of leftover shedboard flat against it as a temporary brace, and held it there with his own weight for what felt, in that dark and narrow space, like far longer than it likely was. The draft did not return. Whether it was the packing that held, or the wind easing back toward its earlier direction sometime in that same hour, neither of them could say for certain. Not that night, and not in the years afterward when the story was told again. What they knew, lying still in the returning warmth with their son's breathing settling back into its steady rhythm, was that the room had held, and that the choice made in the dark, however uncertain it had felt while they were making it, had been enough. The storm broke 2 mornings later, the wind falling away sometime before dawn, leaving behind a silence so complete that Caleb woke from it before he woke from any sound. He walked outside into snow nearly to his knees, into a cold that still bit sharp through his coat, and looked back at the cabin the way he had looked at it that first morning back in January, as a shape, a problem, a space that had to be filled with warmth, whether or not there was enough fuel to fill it. This time, the shape had held. The woodpile, when he counted it that morning, had roughly a week's worth of fuel remaining. Thin, but enough, with the weather beginning at last to loosen its grip on the valley. Their son's cough, which had worsened and eased and worsened again over the past month, had settled by the storm's end into something closer to ordinary, the kind of cough a healthy child carries through the tail end of a hard winter, rather than the kind that keeps a mother awake, counting breaths in the dark. Silas Pruitt came by 3 days after the snow stopped, on some excuse about checking fence lines that neither of them quite believed. He stood in the doorway of the cabin for a while, looking past Caleb toward the small wooden room, still standing in the corner, its narrow vent still cut into the front wall, a seam near the base still faintly patched with wool and moss. He did not mention the jokes he'd made in October, He only asked, after a long, quiet moment, how it had been built, and whether a room of similar size might fit in the corner of his own place before the next hard freeze came through. Word of the small room traveled further than that over the following months, told and retold by neighbors who had never seen it themselves, growing stranger and simpler in the telling the way such stories tend to. What mattered, though, was not the wood, or the exact width of the vent, or the precise mixture of moss and rag that had sealed the worst of the drafts. What mattered was a boy who made it through that winter breathing easier than he had any right to, given how it started, and a family who had learned, the hard way, that the coldest room in a house is not always the one facing the weather. Sometimes it is simply the one too large for what little warmth a family has left to give it. The room did not make the winter shorter. It only gave the winter less to take. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.